It's been a couple months since my last update on the John Deere 60 restoration progress, or I should say the teardown process anyway. So here's an update for you guys now that I've had a little bit of time to work on it here. So I've been trying to adhere to my original goal, or my original plan of tearing this thing apart from front to back and then from top to bottom. And so far I think I'm pretty well on my way. As you can see here, I've actually got it split now. I have the front frame section off, or removed from the main case, I should say. And I've really come to appreciate the simplicity of these two-cylinder tractors. I mean, splitting this thing really was not much trouble at all, even compared to a more conventional, tractor with an upright engine and whatnot. Once I got the frame section here removed, or once I got everything unbolted and loosened up, the rest of it, I mean, the main engine, components, the block, the head, the crankshaft, rods, pistons, and all that stuff came out, fairly easy. And with these two-cylinder tractors, they're basically split into thirds. You have your front frame casting, which is this massive section here. You have your crankcase and transmission case, which is all one unit, or you could say the center section. I mean, all of your rotating assembly is either bolted to or housed within this piece of casting right here. And then you have your final drive, or your rear differential, which is a little bit longer and heavier on this tractor, being that it's a vegetable tractor. But like I said, my goal was to start at the front and work my way back. So I got everything stripped out of the frame section here, the frame casting. Shortly after I made the last update video, I pulled the valve cover off, and then I pulled the rocker arm assembly off. I removed the push rods, and was finally able to remove the cylinder head, which I don't have it here right now. I have the head and the block and crankshaft, along with the pistons and rods, out at the machine shop to get cleaned up. But like I said, once I got the rockers and push rods out, got the head off, and finally saw the mess that awaited me inside the cylinders. And as I expected, there was plenty of rust, some rodent droppings in the bottom of the cylinder, which was a little surprising. And just a combination of sludge, mud, the most disgusting stuff you've ever seen, probably, just sitting in the bottom of the cylinders, which explains why when we tried to crank it over by hand a couple years ago, it didn't want to budge, because everything was just so tight inside those cylinders with all that debris in there. And in hindsight, I'm actually glad we weren't able to break it loose, because usually if you take an engine like this that's been sitting for a long time and you try and turn it over and break it loose, it's usually, you're going to end up damaging something, whether it's your cylinder walls, your pistons. It's because something's got to give. So I cleaned out the debris out of the cylinders, and then I just out of curiosity, I took a dead blow hammer and a 4x4 block of wood, shoved it down into the number one cylinder, and I just started wailing on it with the dead blow hammer. And to my surprise, it actually did start to turn. The piston started to move in, the crankshaft started to turn. So I moved the wood block over to cylinder number 2, gave it a few hard whacks with the dead blow hammer, and number 2 started to move. And I just kept hitting it, trying to loosen things up, watching the crankshaft turn. And I can't say that the engine was completely free to the point where I could turn the crankshaft over completely by hand, or turn it over completely by hand, but it wasn't rusted stuck. So that certainly saved us some potential headaches. And from that point, I just started disassembling everything. So like I said, I had the frame section out, and when I pulled the frame section out, the block had started to separate from the front of the main case. So I pulled the block out after I undid the rod caps, and the number 1 piston and rod stayed in the cylinder, so they came out with the block, but the number 2 piston and rod had just stayed there. They stayed connected to the crankshaft. So once I got the block removed, I was able to pound the number 1 piston and rod out with the dead blow hammer. No trouble there. And at a quick glance, I mean, I didn't really do a thorough cleanup job. That's what I'm having the machine shop do. But just at a quick glance, the cylinders actually didn't look too pitted. The pistons looked okay. And the rod bearing surfaces and the journals on the crankshaft looked okay. I mean, the crankshaft is going to need to be cleaned up and probably ground down anyway. Waiting to hear back from the machine shop right now on how far they're going to take it. And I also need to see how far the block is going to need to be bored out, because that's a replacement block. It's not the original block that was in this tractor. The original block cracked 50 years ago and had to be replaced. So it's standard bore, and they're going to want to bore it out. But the machine shop's telling me I should probably go 125 thousandths over, and I really don't want to have to do that unless it's a last resort. With these 2-cylinder blocks, you can bore them out 45 thousandths, 90 thousandths, or 125 thousandths oversize. And the thing is, if you bore it all the way out to 125, then if you want to rebuild it again in the future, you got to sleeve it and start all over. So I am going to be using this tractor for plow days and for pulls and whatnot, so it is going to be a worker. So I will probably end up having to rebuild the engine at some point again in the distant future. Once I've got a lot of hours on it of use. But I figure, that being said, I would prefer not to punch the engine out as wide as it'll go. That way I have more room for when I rebuild it in the future. So I'm hoping I can get away with 45 thousandths or 90 thousandths at the absolute worst. And the issue I'm running into right now is nobody seems to have any stock as far as 45 or 90 thousandths over American-made pistons. These first numbered series tractors, so the 50, 60, 70, and so on, use cast iron pistons. They were the last of the 2-cylinders to use cast pistons. And then when the 20 series came out in 1956, 57, they switched to aluminum pistons as a way of increasing the horsepower and the compression. So for most of the guys, when they're rebuilding these number series tractors, one of the big upgrades to do is to change to aluminum pistons. So that's what I'm going to be doing for this tractor. I don't think the original cast pistons look terrible, but for what they're worth and for the potential increase in horsepower, you might as well just go with a high compression like an M&W style aluminum piston. So that's what I'm going to do. But like I said, the problem is nobody right now there are no American manufacturers that actually make a 45 or a 90 thousandths over aluminum piston, unless you go with a Riley brand piston, which a lot of the aftermarket suppliers carry. They're made in Taiwan, and I hear they're pretty good quality, but I don't know how I feel about putting those in my tractor. I prefer to stick to American made if I can. It's a 2-cylinder engine. It's only got 2 of them, so if I can get lucky, find a set of M&W style new old stock pistons in the oversized that I'm looking for, then I'll definitely use them. But right now the search continues, so I'll see what's out there. I've tried a lot of the aftermarket suppliers like Sharps. They're out of stock, so I'll keep looking, see what I come across. But that's kind of where we stand right now as far as the engine's concerned. The machine shop is still 3 or 4 weeks out before they're able to get to my block and everything. So once we get to that point, I'm going to, once they tell me, once they clean things up and tell me what the engine looks like inside, how far we're going to have to bore it, then I can kind of, gauge from there where we're going to have to go. But what they'll do is I'll get them the pistons, they'll clean up the rods, grind the crank, bore the block out, and then we'll, once I get them the pistons and everything, they will put it all together and check for clearance and all that stuff to make sure everything is going to fit properly. And the particular machine shop I deal with is a pretty well-known Amish machine shop here in Lancaster County. They do a lot of 2-cylinder blocks, so they're definitely no strangers to these old 2-cylinder Deeres. So I figured, instead of me trying to do this stuff myself without the proper tools or measuring equipment, I'll just let them, mic everything and see where we are. So, like I said, that's kind of where we stand right now. Of course, you can't remove the crankshaft without removing the clutch assembly, clutch operating fork, pulley, driver, the whole 9 yards. The clutch fork came out fairly easy. I actually shipped that one out west to a guy who rebuilds them, so he's going to refurbish that and make it like new. The clutch pulley, unfortunately, cannot be saved unless somebody has a good way to spot weld the broken cast piece here. I have another good clutch pulley on my parts donor tractor, so I'm just going to end up swapping that over. But that was such a tight fit on the crankshaft splines just due to rust. It was a little bit of a challenge getting that off once I got the clutch driver removed. I actually made a custom puller out of a piece of steel I had laying around just to get the clutch puller, or the clutch drive gear off. You can see it looks pretty crude here. So it's literally just a piece of scrap steel with 2 holes in it. But that ended up being pretty useful for removing the clutch driver. So unfortunately, the clutch driver did not survive. I had to sacrifice a few of the teeth on it. For the longest time, I don't know if you can see there, one of the teeth had been missing, and they just ran it like that for years, but I broke 2 more of the teeth trying to get it off. So, and I figure it had been exposed for so long because the tractor sat there without a cover on the clutch pulley for many years. It's going to need to be replaced anyway. I'm going to go through, replace the whole clutch assembly, driver, discs. The clutch operating fork, like I said, is out getting rebuilt, so that's going to be all like new. Once I got the block, the head, and the pistons and rods out, removing the crankshaft was a bit of a challenge, mostly just because I don't think the crankshaft had ever been out of this tractor before. I think they left it in when they rebuilt the engine the first time, and the bearing housings were so, stuck to the sides of the case. Getting them off, just getting them popped loose was a challenge. So, and the main bearings had some rust in there too. I think some moisture definitely got in there. So the main bearings are most likely going to have to be replaced. I'm not sure if we can replace the bearings themselves in the housings or if we have to replace the housing assemblies. I actually have a new old stock bearing housing assembly for this side here. So worst comes to worst, I'll probably just end up using that instead. I ended up having to beat the end of the crankshaft with a dead blow hammer just to loosen it up, to kind of jar it loose, to get the bearing housings loosened up on both sides. Hammer it this way and then hammer it from the other way, and it did work. It didn't damage the crankshaft. You're not going to damage the crankshaft doing that, but it's definitely like a game of operation, because you just have to be careful snaking it through the sides of the case there, not to damage any of the journals. So once I got the crankshaft out, I dropped that off at the machine shop as well. The journals on the crank looked okay. I mean, there was a little bit of scoring, but nothing that couldn't be cleaned up. And then I removed the camshaft, and I have the cam over here, and the lobes, I mean, definitely have some rust on them. I'm not sure if that's something that a machine shop can salvage or not. There's a lot of rust on the cam drive gear here as well. I mean, the teeth don't look terrible, but there's a little bit of pitting, so I'm not sure if that's something I can salvage or not. I'm gonna ask around, get some opinions, see what other people think. But for the most part, it all came out pretty easily. The way to do a proper restoration is to take everything apart, and there was so much sludge and oil in the bottom of this crankcase here. I mean, I wasn't going to leave anything untouched, so I got all the oil lines out. I removed the oil pump through the bottom, removed the oil filter neck, I guess you want to call it, and I've just been working the last couple days to flush out this section of the case, just because, like I said, there was so much sludge in here. I kid you not, there was a solid probably 2 inches, 2.5 inches of sludge, oil, dirt, mud in the bottom of this thing, and I ended up having to fill my 30-gallon gas caddy over here and then just continuously flush the thing out with the drain plug out, just flush it out with gas, because that's how much of a mess was in there. And as you can see, I mean, I know the lighting's not great. There's still a good bit of debris down there in the bottom. I'm going to have to flush that all out and then wire wheel it. And once I get it clean, I'm actually going to go through with Gliptol and paint the inside of the case with Gliptol, just to kind of recoat it, reseal it. So, yeah, 50, 60, 70 years of sitting with asphalt-based engine oil and also collecting moisture usually do not end well. So there was a pretty disgusting mess of black down in the bottom of this thing, and I got most of it cleaned out, but I still have a ways to go. So we'll see how much more gas it's going to take to flush that out. I also got a little ambitious one day, and I removed the power troll pump or power troll valve from the rear. That came off pretty easy. And I've seen this on more than one 2-cylinder tractor. The cover plate over the top of the valve usually pits and gets rust holes in it and lets moisture in. And that's pretty much exactly what happened with this valve. You can see the mess of crap inside of here that I'm going to have to clean out. So I'm not sure if that'll be salvageable, but I'm hoping it will be. And according to Shane, the 520 was actually just as bad when he had first taken it apart, because what happens with these 2-cylinders is your battery box is underneath the seat. The batteries leak over time. The bottom of the box gets corroded. They start to rust out. Moisture gets down in there, and then it seeps down into the power troll valve. and rots that all out. So it was bound to happen, and this tractor, had a seat base on it that had rotted away years ago and fell off, and then it was just this cover here was the first thing exposed to the elements, so it just held water all those years. So getting that cleaned out and rebuilt is going to be a little bit of a challenge, but we'll cross that bridge when we get to it. Obviously I haven't disassembled the PTO gear case yet, but that'll probably be the last thing I do at this point before I pull the axles out. I'm not really looking forward to that because the wedges for these wheels have not been touched in probably 50 years, and of course, knowing my luck, the wheels are slid all the way in as far as it'll go, which means once I actually break the wedges loose, I have to adjust them out all the way up across the length of the axle shaft. So I'm not really looking forward to that. Those wedges almost never come off without a fight on a tractor that's been sitting for even a little while, because you get the smallest little bit of rust in between those wedges and it all kind of welds itself together on the axle shaft. And it also doesn't help that both of the jacking bolts that push against the hub or push the wedges out are gone. So I'm a little bit puzzled about what I want to do there. I mean, I'm sure somebody has some tips. I've just been liberally applying penetrating oil to the wedges on and off as I find time, and I'm really hoping I can get these off without having to apply any heat, because I mean, we don't want to weaken any of the structure. These old cast wheels are kind of brittle. And this wheel here, interestingly enough, this one here, this F1478R, is actually a replacement wheel. It's not the original. My uncle told me years ago that they actually did break the wheel on this side just from stress. And you can tell it's a replacement because if you look, there are extra holes cast into this thing for the lugs and clamps, as opposed to an original one, which has about half as many around its whole circumference. So, just a little interesting tidbit, but it's neat to know that they did replace that. And to think, back in the 70s or 80s, you could walk into a dealer and say, hey, I need a new F1478R dished offset wheel. And they said, yep, here you go. Because there were a lot of tractors in our area that were sold with this wheel combination you see here. If worse comes to worse, I actually have an extra set of the A4517R 42-inch centers sitting right outside the building here that I could swap on, but this tractor's always had 38-inch rubber or 38-inch wheels on it, so I'd like to try and keep it that way. So like I said, just doing what I can to try and loosen up the wedges, get these wheels off. I'm going to cross, I'll cross that bridge when I get to it, but I am certainly not looking forward to that. So if anybody has any extra tips about how to loosen these up without having to use heat or excessive force, I'm all ears. You'll also notice that I removed the drawbar from the tractor. That was fairly straightforward because there were only 2 bolts holding the stupid thing into the bottom of the case. I mentioned it in the past. This tractor pulled a lot of wagons for tomato bins and whatnot, and my grandfather frequently had problems with the 4 bolts for the drawbar breaking off inside the casting here, and he'd have to drill them out and replace them. And when I went to pull the drawbar off, 2 of the bolts were already gone. I think they're broken off up inside there, but I haven't really taken a good look at it yet. So those are probably going to have to be drilled out. So, like I said, it only ended up taking 2 bolts to get the drawbar assembly off, and then of course I had to undo the custom half-ass mounts that were made that had it bolted up to the rear axle housing here. They may have worked back in the day, but I'm not even sure at this point if I can salvage the drawbar, because this thing's been welded onto and cut and welded again, on and off so many times. I'm not sure how structurally sound it is. I mean, you can see if you look close, it's been Stevie Wonder welded, I guess you could call it, and then it's already cracked where it was welded. So I don't know if it's going to be salvageable. I would like to try and save it if I can. Just cut the modified parts off and cut down some of the welds and bring it back to its original state. But who knows? I mean, it's been heated on from welding and cutting so many times. I don't know how strong it's going to be. It would be cool to keep and reuse the original drawbar for this tractor, though. And like I said, this tractor pulled wagons. You can see how the hole's pretty well worn. It's an obvious sign of that. And I think from what I've heard from a lot of other vegetable guys in the area, they had similar issues with their 2 cylinders trying to pull wagons with them. They would always break those mounting bolts off inside. So it's a wonder you don't see more of these drawbars modified like this. But you know what? Back in the day, they had to do what they had to do to make them work. So if nothing else, I mean, I have the good usable drawbar off my Parts 60. I'll just throw that one on here, and I'll put this one on the shelf just to look at. I say, I mean, it's definitely a work of art. So far, the only broken bolt that's really given me any trouble is this one right here that holds the foot platform onto the top of the rear axle housing. I got the other one out with ease. That was no problem, but this one broke off, and I've welded onto it and tried to weld a nut to it and turn it out, and haven't had any luck. So I probably just have to cut that off and drill it out, which I was really hoping not to have to do, but it's not, unfortunately, it's not the only one I'm going to have to drill out, because at one time every one of these holes were used, and the holes are all egged out, the threads are stripped, there's broken bolts inside all of them, which is pretty common for tractors that did loader work or had cultivators or mounted equipment. So, you know, I guess that's to be expected with a machine in this condition. I also managed to break one of the 3 starter mounting bolts off when I removed the starter. But luckily the bolts are threaded into the starter casting rather than the case itself. So I ended up just taking a hammer and beating the starter cone to get it out. The cover that goes underneath the starter was long gone, so there was a lot of debris up in there. And if you look at the starter, you'll notice that evidently some rodent had made a home up there in that starter compartment. So and if you look close, you can see there's a lot of pitting on the case too. So I didn't really think there was going to be any saving it. I mean, that's pretty bad. So I went to work with the hammer. I beat on the end of the nose cone and got the starter to fall out of it, since there's no saving it. And the only damage that occurred was right here. It took a little chip out of the casting, so I should be able to weld that up, just put a bead there and grind it and file it down, because these are all these holes go straight through, there's no threads. So getting the starter out actually wasn't as bad as I thought, but I can't say I'm a fan of the starter location on these tractors. I almost wish they had kept them mounted up here on the top like they did on the lettered series tractors, but oh well. I mean, I'll get another starter for it, and we'll get the coal cleaned up, get that welded back up, and we'll be good to go. But this starter has definitely seen better days. Here's a quick look at some of the tin work. I'm really hoping I can save the original hood. I mean, anybody can change a bunch of parts around when they do a restoration, but the real restorers are the ones who try and salvage as many original parts as they can. And this hood's not the worst I've seen. I mean, the gas tank being integrated into the bottom of the hood is what hurts a lot of these, because the gas tanks rot out, and then you gotta basically cut them apart to get them apart. But I'm gonna see if I can have a good body man straighten this thing out and kind of clean it up for us. It's got some dents here, just from going under tree branches and whatnot. The back's kind of folded outward, as you can see. And they always had issues on these 2-cylinder tractors with the fuel fill necks leaking, so you can see where gas had leaked out over the years, and I guess ate away the paint, and apparently ate away the metal too, because there's some pitting there. So that's all going to have to come apart and get cleaned up and probably welded or body filled back together. But I'm hopeful that it can be saved. I mean, it's definitely not the worst hood I've seen. Dash isn't terrible either. I'll get some new gauges from Evergreen Restoration, get some new lights as well. And flywheel cover's got some pitting in the bottom, some rust holes through. That's nothing that can't be patched or welded up. And the crown, or the grill, is really not terrible. I mean, you can see the screens are junk, which is to be expected. A lot of them didn't survive, but the rest of it I think can be straightened out. So, like I said, I'm going to try and do my best to salvage whatever original sheet metal I can, because that's what makes the restoration. These are the pieces that this tractor lived with its whole life, so it would be sacrilegious of me to just throw them in the scrap bin and steal the ones from my parts tractor. I'll only do that if worse comes to worse. But we'll see what I find once I start cleaning those up, taking them apart. I've also got the original brake assemblies over here, so I'll see if those can be salvaged as well. I'm feeling pretty hopeful about this restoration overall. I really don't think it's going to be quite as bad as I thought originally. But who knows? I might end up eating my words later. Here's a little closer look at some of the parts I've removed. You can see like the rocker assembly here. They're all still free, luckily. So I think the rust is probably just flash rust from sitting in here. That should clean up pretty easily, I think. Here's your oil pump. Nothing really, at a quick glance, nothing looks too out of place there. I did end up damaging the pickup screen here when I went to drop it out of the bottom of the case, so I'm going to most likely end up replacing that screen. The steering pump, that's all going to be, taken apart, disassembled, cleaned, rebuilt. I'm going to see if I can take apart the air filter as well. I mean, they're not really designed to come apart, but I feel like it's got to be thoroughly cleaned, because after running that tar-based oil for many years, I mean, you never know what kind of contaminants could be in there. And the governor, that's a whole nother nightmare. You can see the governor arm here, the cast piece actually broke off. I'm not even sure how that happened, but I have another one that I can take off the parts tractor, so that shouldn't be an issue. But you can see she's pretty well full of rust. Flywheel looks okay, splines look alright, and the ring gear looks okay. First production gear, it doesn't look terrible. I mean, it's got surface rust on it. I'm hoping that'll clean up. Radiator's definitely going to have to be re-cored, as you can see. It's got some damage to it. Not terrible compared to what I've seen, but it's got to come apart to do it right anyway. And the power steering valve, that's all going to be disassembled and cleaned and rebuilt. So it'll all happen in due time. It's just, I'm really taking my time with this. I want to make sure I do this right. This is my first time really diving this far into a two-cylinder tractor. So, and this tractor, of course, deserves to be given the new life, with a nut and bolt restoration. So that's where the 60 teardown stands for right now. Nothing too exciting, but I'd say we're about 2/3 of the way apart at this point. Like I said, the main chassis of the tractor comes apart in 3 major pieces, essentially. So front end's apart, engine's apart, and next is to start tearing into the transmission. So my goal is to have it completely stripped apart by the end of the year, and then from there I can start cleaning things up. I'll get all this stuff moved outside. We'll start wire wheeling, cleaning, sandblasting, whatever we got to do. Get everything cleaned up and get it ready for paint. And in the meantime, I'll also work on getting some of these, assemblies over here cleaned up and rebuilt as well. So it's just, it's stuff that takes time. It's the little nitty-gritty stuff like this that's going to take the most time, but at least I can live comfortably knowing that it was all done right and that no bolt on this tractor was untouched. I've said it before, I'll say it again, that's the only way to do a proper restoration. You got to make sure everything is returned to the condition that it was when it left the factory new. So we'll get there. It's going to take a little time, but we're working our way there slowly. So just wanted to give you guys an update, and I appreciate the support and all the comments and everything, and thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.